I was born Francesca Rizzo, became Francesca Morelli when I married Gasper in 1981, and remained that person until 3 weeks ago, the day after his funeral, when I became a mother again, in a new way, in a frightening and almost mystical sense that still echoes in my body like a shiver running down my spine in the pre-dawn hours, when the house is still full of silence and the earth outside the window is just beginning to take on the first colors of a new day. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy. I am 68 years old. My hands are as stiff with arthritis as the frozen branches of the old pear tree by the south wall of the garden, but my memory is stronger than steel, and I remember clearly how, at the first glimmer of dawn, I kneaded dough from flour and sourdough, standing in the kitchen in an old apron, while my son David was still stretched out in bed, and then, opening his eyes, flew down the stairs with that cry of delight that filled the whole house with the smell of hope. The bread he waited for, like a miracle, on Sundays. I remember the smell of my daughter Camilla's hair when, standing behind her in front of the mirror, I braided it into pigtails, trying not to tug, not to cause pain, and how she tugged at the hem of my dress, complaining that she did not want 2 pigtails, but 1, like her friend at school. I am not telling you all this for the sake of nostalgia or to arouse your sympathy, but so that you understand that before everything collapsed, I was simply a mother, a woman who loved, cared, believed that, no matter how difficult it was, she had managed to raise good children who would one day understand why she acted the way she did and, perhaps, forgive her for her inevitable mistakes. Cancer killed Gasper in 14 months. The pancreas is a silent executioner, cunning and merciless, like a cold blade hidden behind a smile. It gives you enough time to put your papers in order, to finish what can be finished, to say the right words, but never enough time to come to terms with it and start living with this knowledge as a part of yourself. At first, we kept everything secret, just between us, without tears, without confession, like conspirators hiding their grief behind the mundane. They don't need this burden yet, Gasper said, lying on his back, looking up at the ceiling of our bedroom, his voice muffled, like the words were seeping through cotton wool, the way the morphine coated his mind. He wanted to keep them safe, David, busy in Boston with his important clients and presentations, and Camille, whose constantly failing plans to save the world with green smoothies and salt baths required new investments and an implacable faith in success. Let them live their lives a little longer without this shadow, he said, and I nodded because I loved him, because I wanted to give him the peace he deserved, but deep down I knew better, knew that our children would not be ready, would not understand that illness was not weakness but courage, and that dying was not a shame but an art to be learned. When they finally arrived at our modest farmhouse on the edge of Millfield, the same one where, under Gasper's rough hands and my gaze searching for harmony and beauty, 20 acres of neglected apple trees had been transformed into a flourishing, state-respected organic orchard, they brought no comfort. They arrived with briefcases and clipboards and anxiety hidden behind smiles that never reached their eyes. "Mom, I'm just trying to be practical," David said at the kitchen table, his voice taking on that icy, condescending tone I'd first heard years ago, when he'd explained to me as a student why the liberal arts were a waste of money. Gasper slept upstairs that night, occasionally groaning softly as the pain broke through its medicinal cocoon. We sat downstairs, me pouring tea into his favorite mug with a crack at the handle, and David talked about medical bills, about profitability, about the need to cut staff, and at one point the phrase flashed out like a scalpel, "It's not going to be easy for you to run this business on your own." I listened and didn't recognize him, not the boy who cried when he lost his first puppy, not the young man who so passionately championed the idea of a just world, but the man who believed that everything could be calculated, organized and predicted. He had left Millfield at 18, saying that the town was suffocating him like Bob Moss, and that the apple trees were a symbol of stagnation, not prosperity. He came only when absolutely necessary, usually staying in a hotel rather than his childhood bedroom because, as he said with a smile that hinted of thinly veiled mockery, "The country air irritates my sinuses, and that air, rich with the scent of moss and damp earth and apple blossoms and the faint bitterness of manure, seemed not just foreign but almost hostile, as if the Pennsylvania landscape itself were reproaching him for leaving as soon as he could." But suddenly, in the last weeks of his father's life, he had developed an almost morbid interest in the family business, the same one that had caused him such undisguised embarrassment as a teenager, when he had been careful not to invite friends over for fear of being seen digging in the dirt with his parents in their rubber boots. Camilla arrived 3 days later, bringing 6 suitcases, 2 carry-ons, and the scent of expensive failure that had clung to the fabric of her designer clothes. 5 wellness projects in 8 years, each one started with Dad's money, with PowerPoint presentations and scented candles, each one dying out at the moment when it was necessary not only to inspire but also to invest, to stand in the market in the rain, to keep records, to pay taxes, to be an adult. But she hugged Gasper with tears in her eyes, her hands shaking, her voice breaking into a whisper, and that night before he died she slept next to his bed, curled up in a ball, like when she was a child and had nightmares about fires and would come running to us, clutching a blanket, shaking all over. That's why I still can't get over what happened next. The funeral was modest, as Gasper wanted, without unnecessary pomp, without funeral orchestras or long speeches. He was buried on a hillside overlooking gardens where the spring flowers were just beginning to appear, primroses and daffodils bursting out of last year's leaves like a promise of something new, something he would never see again. I stood between the children as the coffin was lowered into the ground, David's arms tight around my shoulders, something unbearably mechanical in the touch, like a gesture he had been taught but did not feel. Camille sobbed openly into a monogrammed scarf I had never seen before and only later realized that it must have been part of her props, like the black mourning dress that fitted her perfectly. The pastor said that Gaspard was now at peace, and I wondered if that was true or just the kind of words people use to console themselves when someone dies after much suffering, words that are meant to give meaning to the meaningless. Gasper and I were not religious, but we kept the outward forms, went to church on holidays, listened to the pastor because that was the custom, because sometimes it felt like an anchor in a world that was losing its shape. He knew not to talk about heavenly rewards, which we did not believe in, but about Gasper's love for the earth, the way he understood the rhythms of nature, how he could sense when there would be frost just by looking at the sky, and how he spoke to the trees as if they were listening to him. What I remember most about that day was the silence. It fell over the house like a blanket, thick and velvety, with the taste of the baked potatoes Mrs. Carbone brought in next door and the clink of cutlery mingling with the murmurs of voices telling stories of Gasper's kindness, his honesty, how he helped Mr. Carbone keep his dairy farm going during the recession, or hired the Fabry's sons to pick the crops when they couldn't find work. No one said a word about how he built our business from scratch, how we worked together to raise the earth after the flood of '95, how he dug ditches when his knees were already aching treacherously, and how he got up at dawn to check his kidneys while others were still asleep. No one remembered how many years he lived so as not to leave us debts, and how he hoped that his children would at least partially inherit his values, his respect for work. I cleaned the guest rooms, dusted the bedspreads, laid out clean towels, just as I had done for the last 40 years. I told David and Camille about it that evening, after the last of the visitors had left, when the house was quiet again, and only the clock over the fireplace ticked away the hours. I suggested, maybe tomorrow we could spend the day together and go through your father's things, go over some things, remember. David set his glass of whiskey on the coaster with such precision that the movement sent shivers down my spine, just like Gaspard had done. This, Mom, he began, as if he had rehearsed it beforehand. Camille and I have talked about it and decided that it would be best if we resolved this quickly. We both need to go back. Settle the situation? I asked, looking first at him, then at Camilla, who was bent over her phone as if checking the weather, but, I realized, reading a business email. The estate, she said. The house, the business. David and I need to figure out what to do next. I expected my children to be grieving, someone to remember how Dad taught them to graft apple trees, or how he saved our crop from aphids in 1980. Instead, I got a board meeting. David opened his laptop at the dining room table, where we had once celebrated their birthdays, graduations, and departures, where we had set the cake, blown out the candles, and drank cider. Dad told me about this last year, he began, not meeting my eyes. He was worried about how you were managing the debt. The business needed modernization. Investment. This house is too big for someone your age. My peers, I repeated, and the words tasted as bitter as unripe quince. I ran this orchard with your father for 40 years. And you did very well, Camilla said, in the same voice she had once used to sell nutritional supplements. But it's time to think about your future, Mum. A retirement community will give you friends. Activities. I have friends. I have activities, I said, and my voice seemed to come from far away, as if someone else were speaking. This is my home. This is our entire home, David corrected, and the last layer crumbled when he added, Dad left the business to Camilla and me in his will. He wanted us to look after you. But he knew the business needed young managers. I stared at my son, this stranger in his expensive clothes, perfectly pressed, without a speck of dust, whose smell reminded me not of home but of a business office where air conditioning hides any traces of real life, and everything about him, from his expression to the intonation of his voice, breathed the confidence of a man who thinks he understands something about the land that fed him as a child, about the trees that his father had tended with such selflessness, with some almost sacred reverence in times of drought, blight and night frosts, when it seemed that all the work could go to waste. Show me the will, I said, and my voice was quieter than I expected, but there was not an ounce of doubt in it. Without blinking, with the businesslike politeness he must have learned in negotiation training, he slid the document across the table where we had once baked cookies together, Camilla's laughter ringing through the kitchen like bells on a spring day. But it wasn't the letterhead of our family lawyer, not the document that smelled of Millfield paper, but something printed on David's corporate letterhead, as white as hospital sheets and as cold as the intention behind it. I saw at once that Gaspard's signature looked wrong, too smooth, too firm, as if someone had copied it from another document, too perfect for a man whose hands had been shaking with pain for months even when he held a spoon. You made him sign this while he was on morphine, I said, and a fury rose up inside me, not rational or controlled, but the kind that comes only when you have to protect not just a house, not just an inheritance, but the very essence of who you've been all your life. It was something primal, something I hadn't felt since, years ago, as a young mother, I'd seen a fox trying to get into our chicken coop when the kids were little, and I'd unthinkingly grabbed a broom and chased it with the same mindless but unstoppable rage I now felt at my own son. He was sane, David insisted, his eyes never leaving mine, his voice like a man used to convincing investors. He wanted us to start over. There's a developer interested in the land. A developer for a luxury apartment complex, Camilla added, her eyes shining not with tears but with rosy anticipation, as if a new project was already looming on the horizon, a new glossy cover, another business that could be sold before the first tax audit. They'll pay $7 million. Mom, we can all start over. Again? As if the life Gaspar and I had spent 40 years building, with the early rises, the calluses, the thousands of decisions made in sweat, in arguments, in hope, as if it were all something stale, old, unnecessary, something to be thrown away like a worn-out coat. As if the legacy of the Morelli family orchards, our fight for sustainable farming, our principled stance against selling out to the big chains that squeeze the life out of our workers, our annual donation of 10% of our harvest to local food banks, all of it was insignificant compared to the prospect of houses with lawns and automatic sprinklers for rich vacationers from Philadelphia. Your father would never sell this land to development, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, and to my surprise, it sounded as firm as a pebble at the bottom of a creek. And I didn't sign anything. You don't have to do this, David explained calmly, his face unreadable. The business was in Dad's name. And the house, too. Pennsylvania isn't a community property state. And then I understood. This had been planned. Not yesterday, not since the first diagnosis, maybe not even since the pain began. Maybe they had been waiting for this for a long time. How long had my son, the boy I taught to peel potatoes and tie a tie, waited for his father to die so he could wind up our life's work? How many times had Camille called, not out of concern but to make sure the plan was still in place? I didn't know, and that not knowing was the scariest thing of all. I need time, I said, standing up, my joints creaking in the silence, as if the old house were listening to our conversation. I'm going to bed. We'll discuss this tomorrow. But I already knew, there would be no discussion. While I lay awake in the bed I had shared with Gaspar for 40 years, staring at the ceiling where the cracks spread out like lifelines in the palm of your hand, listening to the quiet trickle of streams beneath the floor, the creaking of beams, the cracking of walls, my children downstairs were making their final preparations, quietly, harmoniously, as adults should, having decided their fates without the participation of those they concern. Morning came with the smell of coffee, not the kind Gaspar and I brewed in the old Cez, but the expensive, shiny kind David had brought from Boston because our store-bought brand was, in his opinion, undrinkable. I dressed slowly, my joints stiff with grief and age and the knowledge that had settled like frost in my bones. My children were no longer the ones I had given birth to. When I came downstairs, they were waiting for me with a small suitcase, gray, simple, practical, in which, as it turned out, they had already packed a few essentials. "We thought we'd take you to see Sunny Pines today," Camilla said cheerfully, her voice ringing like a bell in an expensive boutique window. "It's a beautiful retirement community, only 2 hours away from here." "I'm not going to any retirement community," I replied calmly, pouring myself a coffee. "This is my home." "Mom, be reasonable," David intervened, again using that measured, almost gentle tone of his, as if he were talking to an elderly client. "The paperwork is done. We're closing the deal with the developers next week. You can't stay here." I looked at my son, then looked closely at his face, at those cheekbones, at that look, and I saw nothing of Gasper in it. No warmth, no patience, no stubborn but honest gleam in his eyes with which he looked at us when he stood in the garden passage at dawn, and the first morning light fell in stripes on his shoulders. There was no trace in this man of the boy who once, barefoot, with dried mud on his knees, ran after his father along the rows of apple trees, asking endless questions about pruning, about grafting, about why some trees have pink flowers and others white, why bees circled over some branches and ignored others. I saw before me a stranger, a man in an expensive suit, for whom I had become a problem, an unsolved problem, an obstacle that needed to be carefully, without noise and scandal, removed. "I need my meds from the bathroom," I said, fighting back a shudder that rose from deep in my chest, but it had nothing to do with pain or fear. It was something else, something that bordered on contempt. "And I'd like to take some photographs." "Of course, Mom," Camilla agreed quickly, and in her voice, usually taut and slightly creaky, like a string on a loose instrument, I detected relief, as if she hoped I would dutifully select 3 or 4 trinkets, pay for them with photographs, and disappear into their new, orderly lives. "Take any personal items you want. We can send the rest later." I walked through the house, our house, like a pilgrim saying goodbye to a temple, my fingers brushing the worn wooden railings that Gasper sanded and repainted every 5 years, not because he had to, but because he believed that beauty demanded attention. I ran my hand over the blanket that my grandmother had sewn by hand, stitching together bits of fabric from the old clothes of all the women in our family, and that still lay on our bed, reminding me of roots that could not be transplanted. I stopped at the window seat where, on rainy days, I read stories to the children as the rain ran down the glass, and together we made up sequels, afraid that the book would end too soon. In the bathroom, I took not only the medications neatly arranged in the old cabinet, but also the things I kept in the secret section of the medicine cabinet: my passport, my birth certificate, the sewn pouch containing my mother's gold earrings, and the papers I'd been hiding there since Gaspard had built the box himself in the late 80s, when there had been a spate of burglaries in the neighborhood. In the bedroom, behind his collection of flannel shirts, each still smelling of tobacco and apple cider vinegar, I pulled out the fireproof box that held the things my children had never touched, asked about, or noticed. When I came downstairs, my purse was heavier than before, but my heart was lighter. There was something decisive, solid, about the heaviness. David glanced at his watch. "Ready?" he asked, and though his tone was meant to convey concern, it was not a question. I nodded. Camille came closer and took my hand, her palm cool and soft, like a nurse tending to the residents, and I realized that they no longer saw me as a mother, or a hostess, or a comrade, but as an old woman to be disposed of. We were driving in David's rental car, a sleek black SUV that smelled of dry cleaning and expensive coffee, with leather seats that made my knees stick, and I turned my head to look out the rear window and memorize the house, the spring buds on the apple trees, the weathered paint on the barn that we couldn't repaint because of the drizzle, the stone chimney that Gasper himself had built before David was born. We passed the center of Millfield, the primary school where I had helped children learn to read, and they had written me thank you cards that I still kept in a cupboard drawer. We passed the community center where I taught sewing classes every Wednesday evening, where women my age shared recipes and memories, where I felt I was still making a difference. But instead of continuing along the main road, towards the usual retirement communities, David abruptly turned onto County Road 27, a narrow country road that wound through fields, used only by farmers and school buses, and 20 minutes later, without a word, He pulled over beside an empty, weedy field. The car was still running, the engine purring softly, as he turned to face me, his eyes calm, his face eerily still. "This is where you get off, Mom," he said, as if he were announcing boarding. "The house and business are mine now." I blinked, my fingers clutching at my purse as if it were the last thread of reality. "What?" I breathed. Camilla, sitting next to me, looked down, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. "David, what are you doing?" "We agreed," I began, but he cut me off. "Mom isn't going to make this easy. She'll contest the will, make a scene, embarrass us in front of the developer. It's cleaner here. She has medicine, clothes. There's a gas station 5 meters away. She can call her friends from Sewing Circle." He reached over me and opened the door. "Go away, Mom." I looked at him one last time, searching for something, a glimmer of the boy who had asked for one more bedtime story, and found nothing but cold and profit. Then I turned to Camille, and her eyes darted between us, wide as a cornered animal, her mouth opening and closing but no words coming. "Camille," I called, but the answer was already in me. She always followed him. She always took the easy way out. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, hiding her eyes. "It's just, we need the money. I'm in debt." I nodded, picked up my purse and the small suitcase they had packed, carelessly, thoughtlessly, like someone packing luggage for a hotel, not for life, and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, sharp little stones falling under my feet, which immediately seeped through the soles of my ballet shoes, which were not designed for running, or for exile. The spring air was cool, it smelled of freshly plowed earth, slightly damp from the recent rain, and something else, freedom, broken memories, and old grievances that had accumulated in these places over many years. I stood, squeezing the strap of my bag in my palms, not feeling its roughness, not feeling its weight, just waiting for the moment when the car would move and carry my children away. David did not look back, did not slow down, did not leave even a farewell gesture. Camille looked at me from the rear window, her face pale as fine porcelain, and before the SUV crested the hill and disappeared around the green curves of the road, I caught her expression, not fear, not regret, but something between an admission of guilt and the weakness of not being able to resist it. No phone, no money, or so they thought. Just my name, and what they didn't know, what I still had, what I had saved, like the seeds of a past harvest, in case the future didn't grow. And then, on that gray roadside, amid the sounds of bees and the distant hum of passing vans, I knew I wasn't alone. I was free. Free from pretending that these two deserved my love simply by right of birth, free from the weight of motherhood, which, as it turned out, was not a guarantee of gratitude but merely an obligation assumed in the hope that it would grow into understanding. Free from the hypocrisy of those who saw me not as a person but as an obstacle, a remnant of an old structure that they had decided to rebuild. I did not go to the gas station David had mentioned, did not beg for alms from random kind people, did not bow to their script, written with such certainty as if my will no longer carried weight. I walked toward a future they couldn't even imagine, a future in which I had a passport, my medication, and a document, the original title to 20 acres of land registered under my maiden name, Rizzo, purchased long before we were married, before Gasper proposed combining our lands, long before the kids grew up and decided they knew which was more important, inheritance or cash. Those 20 acres, it turned out, were a sweet deal, land with valid water rights, a resource without which the developer my kids had made a deal with would be unable to build a single home, a single porch. They thought they'd left me with nothing, but I, the woman who'd spent 40 years kneading bread while they slept, knew the value of everything. The walk to town took almost 2 hours. My ballet flats, the ones I wore to my husband's funeral, were starting to rip and my feet were getting blisters. The pain was getting worse by the minute, the sun was getting higher and burning my neck, but I kept going because pain had this amazing ability to strip things down to the core and turn ideas into intentions and intentions into actions. When I finally got to the Lombardo's gas station and grocery store on the edge of Millfield, where the sign Camilla had drawn in high school shop class still hung, I didn't go inside right away. I sat on a wooden bench under the awning, tired but upright, my suitcase under my feet, and just watched the pickup trucks come and go, the gray-haired women buying bread and gas, the young people running in for chips and soda. The people I knew, the people I taught, the people I fed apples to, ordinary, alive, real, and none of them suspected that the same Francesca Morelli who had judged their pies at the county fair for 20 years had just been thrown out of a car, like an unwanted object, by her own children. Mrs. Morelli? I looked up and saw Romeo Lombardo, still the same as before, with a towel slung over his shoulder and slightly calloused hands. Are you all right? You look a little tired. Just resting, Romeo. It's been a long day. He nodded, his gaze sliding to my suitcase, and without asking too much, he just said softly, I'm so sorry about Gasper. He was a good man. Yes, he was, I said, straightening up. Romeo, can I use your phone? I think I forgot mine. Of course you can. He led me inside, past the beer coolers, past the shelves of peanuts and Pepsi, into a cramped office behind the counter that smelled of paper and old wood. Take your time. I didn't call anyone from the sewing circle, as David had suggested. I dialed Vincent Gallo, our attorney, a tried and true man who kept his word and knew the ins and outs of our land. Francesca. I've been trying to find you. I was surprised not to see you at the reading. My hand tightened on the phone. What reading? I asked, already knowing the answer. Vincent paused, and I heard him shuffling papers. The reading of a will. Your son submitted the document, but... I was hesitant. I tried calling. I was unwell, I said evenly, but inside I was seething. Vincent, I need your help. And I need discretion. You have both. My office. 1 hour. I'll be there. I hung up and bought a prepaid phone before leaving the store, paying with the cash I kept in a secret compartment of my bag, the same emergency money Gasper insisted we carry with us after we once blew a tire in the middle of an empty highway. I bought a bottle of water and a sandwich, even though I wasn't hungry. Romeo refused to take the money. It's on the house, Francesca. If you need anything else, just say so. His kindness almost broke me, almost, but I didn't cry. I didn't cry at Gasper's funeral. I won't cry now. Vincent's law office occupied the second floor of a Victorian house on Main Street, the same one where, as a child, Camilla had loved to gaze at the stained glass windows that shimmered with color on sunny days, and where every creaking step echoed the passage of time trapped within the wood. When his secretary saw me, her eyes widened, as if she had seen a ghostly figure rise up out of the rumors and silences of the last few days. Mrs. Morelli, Mr. Gallo is expecting you, she said quickly, jumping up from behind her desk, where files were neatly arranged. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? I'm fine. Thank you, I said, my voice as smooth as a knife edge that had just been sharpened. Vincent met me at the door of his office, his tall figure slightly hunched, his posture lacking the confidence of youth, but his eyes as clear, firm, and penetrating as ever. He was a year younger than Gasper. They had gone to school together, started their lives in this city together, and it was he who had drawn up all our documents, guided us through the formalization of the combined business, recorded the wills, the contracts, everything that concerned the legal side of Morelli's life. Francesca, he said, and with a gesture invited me not to the table, as usual, but to 2 leather chairs by the window. He sat down next to me, without creating the distance that power or profession create. Tell me what's going on. I told him. Without embellishment. Without emotion. Like a cold chronicle, in which each word is a line on marble. A conversation after a funeral, a forged will, a trip, exile, a suitcase on the side of the road. With each new detail, the shadow on Vincent's face deepened, as if he were seeing something more than the order of things crumbling. The will they showed you, he said when I had finished, his voice honed by decades of practice, is not the will Gaspard and I prepared last year. Their document is a forgery. I suspected as much, I said, opening my purse and taking out the fireproof box that had carried so many miles like an heirloom. I pulled out the deed to the first 20 acres of land, the part that had been mine from the start, and that none of the children knew about. They don't know about this, I added, holding out the paper. Vincent took the document, unfolded it slowly, almost ceremoniously, ran his eyes over it, nodded respectfully. Clever. Very clever. You and Gaspard were always thinking one step ahead. He was the one who suggested putting this land in your maiden name when you were first expanding. Remember? He said, "This will be our insurance if things go wrong." And now it's a different kind of insurance, I said. Vincent placed the document carefully on his desk, like something that mattered more than just paper. "What do you want to do, Francesca?" he asked, and without looking away, I said, "I want my house back. I want the business my husband built to live on. I want my children to understand what they've done." He didn't flinch at the chill in my voice. He just nodded, without mincing words. "We'll start by making sure you have a place to stay tonight. My sister has a room at Rose Hill, a cozy B&B, just a block from here. And then the legal work starts tomorrow." "No," I shook my head. "I need to move fast. The developer plans to close next week." There was an autumnal understanding in his eyes, the kind that comes only with age. "You're not going to stop at the courts." "The courts are for people with time," I said quietly. "I have a better idea." That night, in the flower-covered Rose Hill house, where slow jazz played and the air smelled of lavender and hot cross buns, I made my first phone call. Not to the children. Let them think I'd fallen down the road, lost, disappeared. Let them guess. I called Harold Winters, the regional manager of Pennsylvania Trust Bank, where Canton Family Orchards, our business, had kept accounts for decades. "Mrs. Morelli, my condolences. Gaspar was a great man." "Thank you, Harold. I'm calling because I found suspicious transactions and I need help protecting what's left." The second call was to Martin Bellini, the agricultural development agent, a man I'd worked with for 15 years, a man who knew every vineyard, every harvest zone, and every land dispute in the county. "Francesca, I was at the funeral. I wanted to come over. I know, Martin. It was all too much. I need information on farmland development. Urgent." The third was to Sophia Delaney, editor of the Millfield Gazette and Gaspard's second cousin, a woman who knew what it was like to be a Morelli. "Ellie, how are you?" "I'm coping. But I think you'll have a story: developers, protected land, and forged wills. Do you think it'll be interesting?" I'd made 7 calls by midnight. Each one a thread in a web I wove quietly and patiently, sitting in the floral lace of the blanket, listening to the breathing of the small town where people slept, unaware that Francesca Morelli, the one who settled quarrels, baked cakes for charity fairs, decorated the church for Christmas, would no longer be a peacemaker. Because now I was preparing for war. That morning, I met Vincent in his office with a notebook covered in small, neat handwriting, each line containing names, dates, contract numbers, accounts, paragraphs of agreements, lists of equipment, suppliers, donors, tenants, and debt obligations, everything Gaspar and I had collected, built, grown year after year, like trees, slowly, carefully, with the understanding that the roots are more important than the fruit. "I need you to freeze the company's accounts," I said, handing him the notebook. "And that you file an emergency injunction preventing any attempt to sell the property based on a fraudulent will." Vincent flipped through the pages, his eyebrows raised, his gaze intense, like a chess player who realizes his opponent is playing to win. "It's comprehensive," he said with respect. "I've had 40 years with Gaspar," I said. "I know every contract, every client, every little detail of this business. And now I'm going to use it all." "Your children won't take this well," he said, not as a warning but as a fact. "I'm counting on it," I said. By midday, everything was in motion. Vincent had filed a motion for an emergency injunction preventing the sale of the property. Harold Winters had placed a hold on all transactions on the company's accounts, singling them out for further review based on suspicious activity in recent weeks. Martin Bellini, with his unwavering commitment to preserving farmland, had contacted the Environment Council to advise them of the protected wetlands on the proposed site, the same wetlands that were part of my 20 acres, registered in my maiden name. And I sat in Vincent's office, feeling the weight of time, the hands of the clock approaching the single line, 1 o'clock, when my children would find a neatly woven plan unraveling before their eyes. My phone rang, a new one, a prepaid one, the number they weren't supposed to know. But Vincent had made sure they got it. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "It's Francesca," I said evenly. "Mom." David's voice was strained, hoarse, as if he was holding it in with difficulty. "What have you done?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "I was just getting started." "Mom, be reasonable," he began, his voice hardening. "You can't just start freezing accounts and filing restraining orders. Do you even realize what you're doing with our deal?" "Your deal," I corrected calmly. "Not mine. Not your father's. Yours." There was a brief pause. "Where are you?" Camille's voice broke in, shrill as a ringing bell, frightened and indignant. David must have turned on the speakerphone. "We were alarmed," she said, and the lie hung between us, heavy, sticky, like smoke in a locked room. "You didn't call the police," I pointed out. "You didn't tell your friends. You were just busy completing your betrayal. Were you worried that I would survive? That I wouldn't disappear as conveniently as you hoped?" "That's not fair," Camille whispered. "David made a mistake." "Shut up, Camille," he barked. I smiled again, looking at Vincent, who was listening to the conversation, leaning forward slightly. "Listen carefully," I continued, and my voice was like ice on a slope, beautiful, but deadly slippery. "I'm giving you one chance to get away with something. Put away your fake will. Sign the business and the house back over to me. In return, each of you will receive a lump sum payment of $50,000. After that, we will be done." David laughed, harshly, coldly, as if he were laughing not at me but at himself, for allowing himself to think that I would not fight back. "You are delusional. You have nothing. The will is valid." "The will is a forgery," Vincent interjected, leaning toward the speaker. "As the lawyer who drew up the original will of Gaspar Morelli, I can testify to that. The signature on the document you presented does not match the sample signed in my presence." There was silence. "You have 24 hours, I said. There will be no offer after this. And I am going to the prosecutor's office to charge you with fraud." I hung up before they could answer. Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying me as one studies a storm on the horizon. "Do you understand that they will most likely refuse?" "I'm counting on it," I replied and stood up, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. "Now I need to visit the bank in person." The next 24 hours passed as if in a fog, from which only calls, signatures, meetings, scans, faxes, cups of cheap coffee and thin smiles of support emerged. I went around institutions, shops, editorial offices, municipal offices, not like an old widow, but like a woman who knows what she wants. People who had known Gaspar and me for decades recognized me not by name, but by my voice, by my gait, by my look, in which there was no longer grief, but precision. They opened archives, looked for copies of checks, brought duplicate letters and receipts, offered help, not out of pity, but from memory. And perhaps it was out of a light, sweet joy that the Morelli children, the same ones who had left to shine elsewhere, had now returned to the city not as victors but as debtors. By evening I had moved into a small apartment above Eleonora's bakery, a cozy, warm space with low ceilings, slightly slanted floors, and windows that overlooked the roof of the neighboring shop, but it felt like the safest shelter on earth. The owner, Eleonora Sartori, had been my friend since the time our children first held hands in kindergarten, not yet knowing that their lives would flow in different directions, and now, when I knocked on her door with a suitcase and tired eyes, she simply put the key in my palm and said, "Stay as long as you need. Your boy was never right, not in this city, not in the way he looked at you and Gaspar." I nodded, and only in her voice, full of unconditional faith, did I allow myself to relax. Surprisingly, I slept well that night, without dreams, without disturbing shadows on the ceiling, lulled by the warm, familiar smell of bread and baking rising from below in the early morning, a smell that reminded me of a life before all this, a life when Camille called me into the kitchen to taste the dough, and David, still a schoolboy, dragged crusts of still warm rye bread. That morning, dressed in clothes I'd borrowed from Eleanor, Shabby but clean jeans and a soft knit sweater. I drank a strong cup of coffee, pulled my hair into a tight bun, and headed out to battle. At 9 o'clock sharp, when the title office opened, I turned in a packet of paperwork that, like an archive of my entire adult life, contained proof of my right to the original 20 acres of land, including the main house, the barn, and, more importantly for the upcoming development, the only well access to water, the very resource without which no plan would become reality. At 10 o'clock, I met with representatives of the Agricultural Board, where I confirmed that several years earlier, at Gasper's insistence, he and I had quietly and almost unannouncedly drawn up conservation easements, restricting any form of development on the land that my children were now so interested in. The self-imposed restrictions were the very shield that made any development not just problematic, but practically impossible. Even if David and Camilla had somehow convinced the developer to go through with the deal, they would have run into a wall that had been built up in advance, brick by brick, year after year. That afternoon I sat in the Millfield Gazette office, in front of Sophia Delaney, holding the same documents, but now with a different purpose, to hand them over to a journalist, to a cousin who remembered Gasper not for his business and papers, but for his laughter, for the tomatoes he grew, for his stories about soils and caterpillars. We discussed the headline, Local Garden at Center of Inheritance Dispute. Developers' plans threatened by protected agricultural land. Sophia understood how to construct a narrative, not from revenge but from facts, not from emotion but from truth, and I knew that by tomorrow morning, everyone who had ever eaten apples from our trees would have read this story. At 2 o'clock my phone rang again. I didn't say hello. The offer is off the table, I said immediately. Mom, you're making a terrible mistake. David's voice no longer sounded like a banker, but like a boy who's scared. The sharp edges of his intonation had softened, giving way to a nervous tremor. The developer's lawyers are threatening to sue us if we don't meet our obligations. We could lose everything. That sounds like your problem, I said. Not mine. And not your father's. It's our problem. Camilla intervened, her voice breaking. Mom, please. I used the advance to pay off some of the debt. If the deal falls through, I'll be broke. You should have thought of that before you left me on the side of the road, I reminded her coldly. It was David's idea. She screamed. I didn't know until we were driving. The betrayal between them had begun, as expected, but it brought me no satisfaction. None of it had satisfied me, only the sense of justice, cold as ice water on my hands after a day of gardening. Camilla, I said calmly. The bank statements show that you withdrew $50,000 3 days before your father's funeral. You planned this all along, didn't you? Have you started a new life yet? She was sobbing, but I had heard that sound too often, the same muffled sob she had used since her teens when she didn't get what she wanted. Too late for tears, I continued. Vincent will send you the papers. You sign a release of all claims to the Morelli family gardens and home. In exchange, I will not see you for fraud, attempted elder abuse, or theft. What about the 50 grand? David asked, his business acumen still trying to steer him out of the situation. The offer has expired, I said. You're not going to jail, that's all. I hit the end button without waiting for an answer and set the phone down on the table, staring out the window of Vincent's office. The town I'd spent my entire adult life in was going about its business as usual. Across the street, the farmer's market had opened. As it did every Thursday, people were picking out cheese and bread, greeting their neighbors, laughing, swapping recipes, and none of them were abandoning their mothers by the side of the road. They're going to fight, Vincent said quietly, setting a cup of strong, steaming tea next to me. Let him, I answered. I didn't touch my tea. I had one more call to make. I dialed the number, which I remembered not from memory but from muscle, from sinew, from the depths where everything that was too important to be forgotten lived. I dialed it the way you find your way home at midnight, not because you know it, but because you feel it. Robert, this is Francesca Morelli, I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. I think it's time to call on this favor. Robert Fabry, the same one with whom Gasper had shared a dorm room at Penn State, before I came into their lives, before we had land and children and a generation of pain and toil, remained our friend even when he moved to Philadelphia, even when he became someone whose name was on the covers of law journals, even when he surpassed many who had once considered him a failure. 30 years ago, Gasper had lent him money when his first law firm went bankrupt. Money that had helped him get going, not to be repaid, but because that's what friends do. The firm Robert would later found was now famous for dispatching predatory developers like snakes in a henhouse. Francesca, his voice was warm, like light in a window on a stormy night. I was going to call you myself, as soon as I heard about Gasper. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Robert, I said. But what I need now is help. And I told him everything, about the forgery, about the rejection, about the developer who promised me the world and then pushed me to the side of the road. He listened in silence, without interrupting, and when I stopped, there was such silence that I almost thought the connection had been cut. But then he spoke, slowly, carefully, with the tension in his voice that comes from people who have heard that someone has touched something they care about. I'll be in Millfield tomorrow morning, he said, and there was movement in the words, intent, anger ready for action. Platinum Acres was already on our radar. What they're doing violates at least 6 environmental regulations. We've been looking for a way to stop them for a long time. And now we have it. You. Yes, I said. I have it. Don't sign anything until I get there. And Francesca. I'm sorry about your children. I stopped being a mother 3 days ago, I said. Now all I have is enemies. That evening I sat in Eleanor's kitchen while she closed the bakery, covering the bread trays with damp cloths, preparing the starter for the morning's baking, and I drank tea with honey and watched her knead the dough, with the same hands that had once held mine when I had Camilla for the first time. You should try to eat something, she said, nodding toward the sandwich she had carefully prepared and placed on my plate, as if she knew I would not ask for it, but needed it. You need your strength. I'm not hungry, I said, because it was true. Appetite had died with Gasper. Food was fuel now, nothing more, no pleasure, no taste, just a necessity. I heard Camilla was staying in town, Eleanor said between movements, light and casual, as if we were discussing who had bought the most bonds that day. David's still home. People are talking. Let them talk, I said. Small-town gossip had always irritated my kids. They despised it, considered it provincial nonsense to be left behind once you got your degree and the corner office. But now it was working in my favor. I knew their every move within hours. They couldn't move without becoming part of the local news, and for the first time in years, this town was on my side. Sophie's article comes out tomorrow, Eleanor continued. Front page. The Philadelphia Inquirer called. They want to pick up the story, too. Sound like the developer is having troubles elsewhere. Something about tax fraud and demolitions in other counties. I nodded. I wasn't surprised. Robert had already confirmed my suspicions. Platinum Acres had a habit of preying on the vulnerable, the elderly, the widowed, the bereaved, the unsure where to turn. They made promises they never intended to keep. They grabbed land, squeezed out a profit, and then left. And now they had found me. Was it right for me to raise them the way we did? I asked suddenly. It wasn't an emotional outburst, not an attempt to elicit sympathy, but a sincere, direct question about where I had gone wrong, what turn I had taken. Eleanor stopped her hands in the dough, looked up at me, and her face was all there, tired, sympathetic, angry. You and Gasper were good parents, she said, matter-of-factly. Some trees just rot, no matter what soil they're planted in. I nodded, accepting her answer as a fact that didn't require discussion. The question hadn't been asked for comfort. It was meant to be let go. It didn't matter now. The past was buried with Gasper's body. Only the future remained. And my revenge. Morning brought Robert Fabry, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit with sharply pressed lapels and a steel brown tie that probably cost more than Canton Family Orchards' entire quarterly profits, with 2 of his colleagues following him like the shadow of the law. He gave me the brief but firm hug that old friends do and got straight to the point. We've already filed injunctions against Platinum Acres in 3 counties, he said. Now we'll add your property to the list. I spent the next 2 hours watching the craftsman at work the way a surgeon watches his hands before a difficult operation, knowing that every movement must be precise, every word measured, every comma a trap to ensnare his adversary. Robert didn't just know the law, he wielded it with the grace of a violinist wielding an ancient instrument, coaxing from it not only music but also an oath. By noon, he had prepared documents that would not only block the attempted sale but would contain enough evidence to trigger a government investigation into the developer and his dubious land acquisition practices. "Your children's signatures," he said, laying the neatly typed pages on the edge of Vincent's desk. "We need them to formally renounce any claims they base on the forged will." "Vincent says they do," I added. "They will sign," I said with confidence, "not fake, not theatrical, but the kind that comes when you no longer fear loss. They just need the right incentive." I pulled out my phone, scrolled through a short list of numbers, and made another call. This time to Thomas Winters, the son of Harold, the man who had frozen the accounts, and the assistant district attorney, the guy who had once washed my driveway for a few dollars one summer when he was a teenager. "Thomas, this is Francesca Morelli," I said. "I'd like to discuss the matter of pressing criminal charges." Robert raised an eyebrow at that, but said nothing, watching me make an appointment for the afternoon with confidence and without a quiver in my voice. When I hung up, he nodded respectfully. "You were always tougher than Gaspard gave me credit for." "Gaspard knew how tough I was," I corrected, feeling my insides freeze at the truth I didn't want to admit. "He just never believed I'd have to use it against my own children." Just after 2 o'clock, my phone rang again. "David." His voice was tight, formal, almost impersonal. "We'll sign the papers," he said, without greeting me, without asking how I was. "But we need something in writing that you won't press charges." I offered that yesterday, I reminded him. "The terms have changed." "What do you want?" he asked, and there was no bargaining in the question, only weariness. He sounded defeated, and I felt no satisfaction, only deeper weariness. "Be in Vincent's office at 4. Bring Camille. I'll lay out my terms there." When they entered the office, I was already sitting between Robert and Vincent, as if behind a shield, behind an impenetrable wall that protected me not only from their words, but also from possible attempts to pity, to blur the lines. A united front of legal firepower. My children looked bad, David unshaven, his expensive shirt wrinkled as if he'd been tossing and turning all night, Camille with smudged makeup, her face pale, her hair pulled back into a sloppy ponytail as if she'd left the house in a panic. Neither of them could meet my eyes. "Sit down," I said, gesturing to the 2 chairs across from me. "This won't take long." Robert pushed the papers toward them, his voice dry and formal. "Mrs. Morelli has agreed not to prosecute charges of will forgery, fraud, elder abuse, and attempted embezzlement of approximately $12 million. In exchange, you will sign these papers declaring the will invalid and relinquishing all claims to the Morelli family orchards, residential properties, and associated assets." David glanced at the document, his face turning gray. "It says here that we are disinherited completely." "Yes," I said simply. "Exactly what you tried to do to me," I added, turning to Camilla. "The only difference is that I am offering you a legal way out, rather than dumping you on the side of the road." "Mom, please," Camille's voice wavered, breaking on the word. "I know we've made a terrible mistake, but please stop." I raised my hand. "This isn't a negotiation," I said, my face expressionless. "Sign, or I'm going across the street to the district attorney's office and filing a report. Thomas Winters is waiting for my call." Thomas's name was like a cold shower. David went even paler. He knew Thomas from school, another local boy he'd looked down on as a boy with ambition and an expensive watch. A boy he'd considered a small-town loser. A boy who now had power that David had never achieved. "You're really going to do this?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine, almost childish disbelief. "Send your own children to prison?" There was pain in the question, not so much for the act itself, but for the possibility of it. As if he had just realized that the woman who baked him cookies, who bandaged his scraped knees, could become someone to be afraid of. "The woman who would have forgiven you everything died on Beltway 27, I answered, without raising my voice. You left her in the dust. David was the first to look away, and there was no remorse or pride in the movement, only the weariness of a man who for the first time realized that he had lost, finally and irrevocably, and then he reached for the pen Vincent offered and signed the document with a trembling but still recognizable signature, similar to the one he had used to sign Christmas cards to his grandmother as a child. Camilla spent more time, staring at the paper as if it were a death sentence, and when her pen finally touched the signature line, tears were dripping down onto the page, leaving marks that no legal decision could erase. "What now?" she asked, her voice quieter than the rustle of the paper. "You are leaving Millfield now," I said, gathering the signed papers into a neat stack. "Both of you. Today. If I see either of you in this town again, I will press charges, regardless of what you just signed." "And the developer?" David asked, his voice holding a last, dim spark of an attempt to salvage something. Robert smiled slightly, predatory, like a man who has already sprung a trap. "Platinum Acres will be formally notified that the property has never been sold, has never been offered for sale, and cannot be subject to legal agreements. They will also receive advance notice of our intention to file a civil suit for their part in what we believe is a deliberate conspiracy to defraud a widow. Your partners have the wrong woman." They left without another word. No look, no attempt to apologize, no backward glance, just slumped shoulders in defeat and two silhouettes disappearing through the door. I watched from Vincent's office window as they walked to their cars, not side by side like brother and sister, not together like accomplices, but separately, each in their own frustration. David to the rented SUV that remained a reminder of his supposedly successful life, Camille to her bright red convertible, the same one Gaspard had bought her last year when she convinced him that a new look would save her business. Neither of them turned toward the office. Neither looked at each other. They left not just defeated, they left strangers. "It's done," Vincent said quietly, closing the folder and putting the documents in the safe, clicking the lock. "But it's not over yet." "No, not yet," I agreed, feeling the heaviness I'd been living with for the past few days shift but not disappear. The legal battle had been won, but my war, old and stubborn as a weed among fruit trees, had one final act. "I need a ride," I said, turning to Robert. "Where?" he asked. "Home." The Morelli farmhouse greeted me with silence and light, the white siding warmed by the last rays of spring sunlight casting reflections on the porch, where Gaspard's rocking chair still stood where he had spent his last days, wrapped in a blanket and watching the first flowers bloom in the gardens. Only David's rental car on the gravel driveway indicated that the house was not empty. "Do you want me to come in with you?" Robert asked, turning off the engine. "No," I said, clutching my bag. "I'm doing this part alone." It was quiet inside, almost eerie, the way places where there had recently been arguments and now have that quiet that comes after a hurricane. I walked through the first floor, my eyes taking in the traces of presents. David's laptop left on the dining room table, a glass of whiskey with the last of it evaporated almost to the bottom, a pair of dirty shoes by the door, the same ones he had never left here in disarray when he lived with us. "David," I called, and my voice echoed in the empty rooms where I had once sung lullabies, where people had once kicked a ball, laughed, cooked, lived. There was no answer. I walked up the stairs, running my hand along the wooden banisters Gaspard had carved and sanded during our first year in the house, when we didn't even have a dishwasher yet, but we already had faith that we could survive. Upstairs, the door to Gaspard's and my bedroom was ajar, a warm strip of light coming from underneath. I pushed it open and walked in. David stood by the window, his back to me, looking out at the garden where the apple trees were blooming white. The room was in disarray, the dresser drawers pulled out, the closet doors open, Gaspard's clothes strewn across the bed, the same bed where we had shared everything: joy, sleep, pain, childbirth, scars, and goodbyes. "Looking for something?" I asked, my voice as cold as steel in the morning air. He didn't flinch or turn around. "I know there must be more here. Papa wouldn't leave everything to you. Your father trusted me," I said. "Trusted me in a way that you never seem to have learned to trust anyone." He turned. His face was contorted, not just with anger, but with something else that comes with the realization of total loss. "You ruined everything," he said. Deals fell through. Camilla's creditors are calling her every half hour. My firm has launched an internal investigation. I can't explain why I was absent. Everything is falling apart. Actions have consequences, I reminded him. You thought you could cheat, leave, erase, and nothing would change. And now everything has changed. You call this justice? This is a lesson, he asked bitterly, his lips curling into a wry smile. Always a teacher, huh? Even now. Not a lesson, I replied. Justice. I went to the bookshelf, the one that held not only novels and reference books and old newspapers but also pieces of our lives, pieces that Gaspard collected with such loving care, as if he had chosen each book not to read but to speak for him someday if his voice should fail. Among them I found Walden, an old leather-bound edition, covered in pencil marks in the margins, with sprigs of mint and scraps of shopping lists, with a bookmark made from a dried maple leaf. It was his favorite book, the one he read to me aloud on long winter evenings when the snowstorm raged outside and the children slept, and we were alone on the sofa, by the light of the lamp, with cups of herbal tea. I opened the book and pulled out a sealed envelope, a little worn but whole, with neat, clear handwriting, to David. Read after my death. I knew it existed. Gaspar had given it to me a week before the end, had said it was his last letter to his son, his own way of leaving a period, not a comma. I had intended to give it to David after the funeral, when the words might mean something, when the silence he would remain in would be filled with meaning. But then I did not yet know who he had truly become. David, as if sensing it, reached for the envelope, but I pulled my hand back. Did you grieve for him at all? I asked. Or were you too busy trying to figure out how to profit from his death? Something flickered in his eyes. Not pain, no. Too late for pain. Shame, perhaps. Or just annoyance at being caught. I loved Dad, he said dully. You liked what he gave you, I countered. Stability. Security. A financial cushion for your next risky project. What was it this time, David? Another failed investment? A casino? Cryptocurrency? He said nothing, and that silence was enough. I put the envelope on the dresser, next to a photo of Gaspar framed in dried laurel leaves. Your father built something that could have supported not only us, but you and your children, if you had had the patience to take care of it the way he did. And you decided to sell it all for a quick buck. For numbers on a screen. The fruit business is dying, he snapped, like a teenager whose toy has been taken away. Dad was too stubborn to admit it, tied to his old ways, to the land, to the people who suck up resources. Development would have made us rich. And destroy everything he valued. And everything I value, I replied. You could have lived a quiet life. With a pension. With an apartment somewhere in Florida. Without a care in the world except morning tennis. But you chose a path that would leave me alone, watching my husband's legacy being bulldozed under the fictitious name of an elite housing complex. He shook his head, not because he disagreed but because he didn't understand. Even now, after everything that had happened. Take the letter and go, I said. Read it. Or throw it away. It doesn't matter. But this is the last time you'll ever come into this house. He took the envelope without saying anything and pushed past me, his hand almost brushing mine, but he didn't even pause. I heard him go down the stairs, the front door slam, followed shortly by the sound of a car starting. Then there was silence, the silence in which a house breathes after another drama has been exhaled, like the aftermath of a long argument. I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the detritus of his search, drawers pulled out in a hurry, shirts crumpled, photographs strewn across the floor. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since I realized, standing on the side of County Road 27, that my children were strangers to me. I began to tidy the room, folding Gaspard's flannel shirts neatly, still smelling of him, gathering up the photographs and arranging them in order, dusting the dresser and locking the drawers, as if giving the house its soul. When it got dark, I went into the kitchen, made a strong cup of tea with thyme and lemon, and went out onto the porch, where I settled into Gaspard's rocking chair. Above me, in the clear spring sky, the stars began to appear, one by one, like the voices of those gone, ready to watch. Below, the garden faded into darkness, but I knew he was there. The trees we had planted together were now full-grown, strong, ready to bear fruit again. The phone rang. "Vincent," I said. "He's gone." "Are you still there alone?" he asked. "I've been alone since Gasper died," I replied. "The difference is that now I know." 3 months later, I sat in the same chair, watching the July sun slowly set over an orchard full of lush, ripe fruit. This year's harvest promised to be bountiful, perhaps the best in 10 years. Not that I was doing it alone. The new manager, a young, determined woman named Clara, Martin Bellini's daughter, had shown herself to be a person with both brains and heart. She knew the land, respected the work, had learned from me, but was already bringing her own ideas, fresh and wise. We worked together, without big words, but with a common goal, not just to preserve the orchard, but to resurrect it. My phone vibrated softly, as if even it knew it was disturbing the peace, disturbing the moment as I sat with my cheek in my hand, watching the evening light stream through the trees in the garden. The message was from Eleanor, back on page 1. "Thought you might like to see." I clicked on the attached image and saw the Philadelphia Inquirer's business section, and on it was a black and white photo of a man in an expensive suit with a blank stare, beneath which, in crisp type, was written, "Platinum Acres CEO accused of fraud." The subheading was Morelli Gardens, the case that had started it all, the one that had set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the uncovering of a scheme to exploit elderly landowners across 3 states. I set the phone down on the table next to the chair, feeling neither euphoria nor triumph, only a deep, heavy satisfaction, as if a scale that had long been out of balance had been set back into place. It was justice, not revenge, though at times like these the distinction between the two seemed almost indistinguishable, like the line between pain and healing. Only a few minutes had passed when another message arrived, this time from an unknown number. "Mom, please. It's been months. Can we talk?" I deleted it without answering, as I had the 12 others that had come since Camilla's name began to disappear from the membership lists of elite clubs, her car towed to creditors, her rental apartment sealed. She had begun to seek contact not after she had repented, but after she had lost everything she had achieved by relying on someone else's. David hadn't been in touch at all, but Vincent had heard from friends that he'd been quietly asked to leave the law firm without fanfare when Morelli's name appeared in the case file. The irony, of course, was that he, who had built a career on manipulation, was being brought down by the very trap he'd wanted to set for his mother. My children had finally learned their lesson. A lesson that involved no lectures, no blame, only consequences. A lesson that some bridges, once set on fire, can never be repaired, that some words can never be taken back, that betrayal is not just a mistake but a choice that leaves a mark on eternity. As the garden faded into darkness, I rocked gently in my chair, listening to the sounds that made this place tick, the chirping of crickets, the distant cry of an owl, the creaking of wood beneath me, all blending into a harmony my children had never learned to hear. I had a notebook in my lap, a thick leather one, and I had begun filling it with plans for the future. How to transform the barn into a farm-to-table restaurant using ingredients grown on site, how to open educational programs for schoolchildren, showing them where their food comes from and how to respect the work and the land, how to expand the organic certification to take Morelli's Gardens to a level worthy of the times we live in. Gasper would have loved these ideas. We had discussed something like this in the early years, when it still seemed possible, when our love was young and children were part of a dream rather than its ruin. "I'm doing it, Gasper," I whispered into the night air, "everything we planned together, everything they tried to ruin, everything you dedicated yourself to. Tomorrow I'll meet with a lawyer who will be creating the Gasper Morelli Agricultural Scholarship, a fund to support students from our district studying sustainable agriculture, agroecology, agro-processing, anything that can make the land respectable again. The fund will be financed from the income my children have tried to turn into a marble condo table and an unlimited credit card. Next week I'll organize the first community harvest dinner, under the stars, in the old barn, with long tables set up for neighbors, friends, those who didn't turn away when I was alone. And in the evenings, as I do now, I'll sit in Gasper's chair, looking out at the garden we've grown. A legacy that, against all odds, will continue. Without them. And yet strong, resilient, real. Like the trees themselves. And if anyone asks if I'm alone, I'll say no. I'm free. This is my story. Some of you might think I'm harsh, ruthless. Some might call it cruel that I cut away my own flesh and blood, with cold clarity, without a shudder. But please remember what I told you at the very beginning. Betrayal by those you raised beneath your heart is not just pain. It's transformation. It burns away sentimentality, it burns away softness, leaving behind not emptiness, but strength. Pure as bone. My children made their choice on the side of Beltway 27. I've made mine, every day since. Don't ask if I've forgiven. Write in the comments, would you forgive? Would you turn away or choose justice? Either way, remember, some people mistake kindness for weakness until they see what it looks like when they stop apologizing.